I think this is one question that in many ways, I think a lot of people will feel is sort of remote. Like, what does that have to do with me? Unless they have a pet that they want to clone or something like that, right? But I think it is important because it's a significant worldview issue. It has much to do with how we understand human beings as made in the image of God and how we understand our mandate given to be stewards of what God has created. So when we talk about cloning, also referred to as somatic cell nuclear transfer, I think this is important because when people hear about cloning and are asked whether they think that we should clone human beings, the overwhelming answer is no. But when they're asked whether we should do somatic cell nuclear transfer for genetic treatment of genetic diseases, they'll say yes. Well, it's the same thing. And so when we're talking about cloning or somatic cell nuclear transfer, there's two types that I'll discuss, and both with cloning of human beings. There's some other things that we could discuss on this, but I think the cloning of human beings is the critical issue. So two types that I would discuss. One is research cloning, sometimes called therapeutic cloning, and the other is reproductive cloning. Okay, so with reproductive cloning, the purpose of this would be that it's another way for an infertile couple to have a child. In other words, it's another form of assisted reproductive technology, although I would argue it's a very different type of form, which I'll come back to. But what happens is you take the woman's egg and the nucleus is removed. It's called an enucleated egg. And then you would take a cell from, say, the father or another donor, a somatic cell. That's where somatic cell nuclear transfer comes from. But a somatic cell is a body cell. It's a non-reproductive cell that would be placed with the enucleated egg. And then it's given either a chemical treatment or an electric charge, and it fuses them together. So it acts as though fertilization has taken place. If it's successful, then it starts to divide, cell division, and you have an embryo. And so with reproductive cloning, that new embryo, just like with in vitro fertilization, that new embryo would be placed in the woman's womb for implantation. So that's reproductive cloning. Now, research cloning or therapeutic cloning is exactly the same procedure. A lot of times it's talked about as though it's completely different. It's exactly the same procedure until you have the embryo. And then what you do with research cloning is you would harvest the stem cells from that embryo, and as a result, the embryo is destroyed. The reason for doing that, much like embryonic stem cell research, in fact, it is a form of embryonic stem cell research, is that you use those stem cells, scientists would use them in research with the hope of finding cure for various diseases, or in my view, in talking to some people who are in research in this area, the idea is simply to gain greater knowledge of early human development. So, how should we evaluate these procedures? My short answer to the question, is cloning ethical? My short answer is no, either form. Most people are opposed to reproductive cloning, but some will accept the advantages of research cloning and say we should go forward with that. In fact, in the United States, there's been a couple of states that have passed laws that allow for research cloning, but prohibit reproductive cloning. Now, this is interesting and tragic, because by law then, what happens is you allow the creation of a human being through cloning, but that human being must be destroyed. Imagine that. This is a law in the United States. It's not a federal law, but in certain states that allow research cloning, that requires the destruction of that human being. This ought not to happen. So the first and most basic objection to human cloning, to research cloning, is the destruction of human embryos. They're created simply to be destroyed. Now, when it comes to reproductive cloning, there are still problems with risk on human lives and destruction, because in animal trials, one might think of the great success of Dolly the sheep, which was 2 decades ago, Well, that success came only after failed attempts, well over 200, I think it was 267 failed attempts at cloning before that successful attempt. And when it comes to human beings, then, are we really ready to allow for the death of so many human embryos, the destruction of embryos in clinical trials before we perfect this technique? And even if we do, the risks that are there in animal trials, again, you've had risks of deformed animals, of all kinds of things like that. Are we willing to risk those things? And we might ask ourselves, are we even in a place where we can be willing to risk those things? I mean, after all, we're not risking something on ourselves, we're risking something for someone else who has no consent in the matter, because consent can't be obtained because they haven't even been created yet. And so all of this leads me to say that even the attempt at reproductive cloning should be halted before it begins. And there is some concern that because research cloning is allowed, generally in the United States where it has been allowed, it comes with a ban on reproductive cloning. But you can imagine that if scientists are able to perfect human cloning, even if it's just research cloning, that having created those embryos, somebody will seek to use them for implantation to bring about a human being. We wouldn't know for years what potential implications that human being might bear because of our interest in cloning. So a second big concern when it comes to reproductive cloning is that in natural procreation, it is the one flesh of marriage, the husband and the wife coming together, that issues forth in the one flesh of the child. So the child is partly from its mother and partly from the father. Neither one of them completely, but here is a unique, distinct individual. And in various forms of assisted reproductive technologies, this can be maintained, but it's different with reproductive cloning. In reproductive cloning, the child who's born is an exact replica of the donor, and that donor could be the father, but that means that the father's DNA is replicated exactly. It's his DNA that is placed with the enucleated egg of the mother, and so the child that comes is essentially an identical twin. And so you think about this, that even though this child that is born is the child of the father, it's also, in terms of DNA, the twin of the father. It is this kind of thing that so disrupts the order of relationships in family and in marriage that we ought not to even attempt these things. One other consideration I would give with reproductive cloning is that some of the prospects of reproductive cloning would be to create a child who is the match for someone who needs something like bone marrow transplant or even a kidney transplant or something. So the child would be created solely for the purpose of serving the needs of another. And this is to treat that child instrumentally and to rob that person of human dignity that all human beings deserve. So even if the mother and father deeply love this child, it would remain true that the reason the child was brought into existence was solely for the purpose of supplying something that their sibling or someone else needed. So finally, and a major concern that I have with prospects of human reproductive cloning is the possibility of eugenics, and that is to engineer traits in the human race positively or eliminate defective traits. And to think that human beings have the wisdom to engineer ourselves, let alone the whole human race, is a hubris that really marks a worldview apart from God. When God gives us dominion and stewardship over what He has created, it surely doesn't include re-engineering the human race. Only God has sovereignty and wisdom to create as He will.
Thanks for watching Honest Answers. Don't forget to subscribe to find out the answer to next Wednesday's question.